Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. I'm Craig Jeffery. I'm your host today. I'm joined here by Royston Costa.
Hey Craig, good to be here.
We are coming to you live from the general site of the AFP conference in Nashville, Tennessee. Our topic for today is generative AI. What's the impact on, and then there's an underscore, impact on the workplace, cash flow forecasting, risk management, cybersecurity, and whatever else pops into our minds. So I don't know how many podcasts we've done over the 7 years the Treasury Update podcast is going. Is it 7, 8, 10?
At least. I'll say one a year, probably. In some cases, twice, at least two.
With generative AI, the broader category of artificial intelligence breaks into a couple different sections, and you've explained that before. There's machine learning, pattern detection, determining what's going on, and then there's generative AI, which is making new things. So I guess the first question, I want to start with cash flow forecasting first to help make a distinction in people's minds, and maybe in my mind too, is using generative AI or machine learning for cash flow forecasting. Which is it? Is it a combination of those two, or is that not an important distinction?
If we look at the overall definition of AI, machine learning, and for that matter, RPA, robotic process automation, are both actually derivatives of AI. When we talk about generative AI, we are really talking about content creation. So AI is artificial intelligence. So you could argue that AI is a broader category, and we all have and use AI whether we realize it or not. I was thinking the other day, actually, if you have security cameras around your house, which a lot of people now do, that's using AI. Even fridges now include AI. It's impossible in my mind to live in this world today and not come across AI. I do accept and recognize in Treasury, it's a bit more challenging sometimes to recognize how AI is A, present, and B, more importantly, how is it adding value, how is it being used? And so let's talk about that, shall we? So machine learning, as I said previously, is that it's really a good example is what we use in our spam filters. That's machine learning, pattern recognition. And so that's constantly evolving, it's learning those patterns and kind of improving on those patterns. But that's very much AI. A part of AI or a version of AI. Robotic process automation is another type of AI where basically you can perhaps use a way of how you automate receiving invoices attached to an email and how that email is then dealt with. So that's again another version or example of how AI works. And this is where we've now come into a new era, let's say. And let's be clear, AI has existed for many, many years. This is not a new technology in terms of its birth. For Treasury, the big change, the way it's being adopted and how it's being so powerful and valuable to Treasury. And now we're going to get into the generative AI bit, the content creation, and more specifically, how it's benefiting Treasury. So we mentioned cash flow forecasting. First of all, I think we'd all agree, cash flow forecasting, huge pain point, probably still is today, frankly, for Treasury. In my mind, it's been a big game changer having generative AI because up till now, there's some excellent cash flow forecasting solutions out there. Invariably, companies like Ferguson have been challenged by our internal infrastructures. Many disparate systems, or there's other challenges in terms of how we get the data or many stakeholders. I think with this generative AI and certainly AI as a whole, there's the ability now to use that technology to automate processes where previously you couldn't. So you're kind of almost simplifying and to some degree eliminating the silos that might have existed before because it's more an internal solution that we can use and apply. When you look though specifically at cash flow forecasting, I'm going to bring in risk management as well because that's also a very good way of demonstrating how generative AI works. What it's doing is it's first of all analyzing a much larger data set because that's what AI does, that's the benefit it brings. But then it's also helping to assess, analyze and provide a kind of summary or proposal, if you like, in the risk side, how you would want to manage your risk, on the cash flow forecasting, how you manage your cash. So this is where the important game changer comes in. I mean, one would argue in the past that might have been done manually to a certain degree using spreadsheets, whereas now with generative AI, a lot of this can be done almost automatically. There are two caveats, and I think I've mentioned this before, health warnings, if you like. AI as a whole is not perfect. We cannot and should not rely on the data 100%. Now, to me, as much as I say that, everyone thinks, oh, well, why are we bothering with AI? Well, how's that any different from what we normally do in Treasury? I think there's a perception in my mind when we look at technology, it's got to be perfect. To a degree, maybe so, but no, there's also this aspect with AI where I believe everyone in the industry recognizes it's evolving. So in my view, like maybe, certainly in a year's time, it will be a lot better than it is today. But it's going to take time for it to be, let's say, call it perfect. So let's say for now, it still needs to be validated. The important part here is it's giving us the automation and the low-hanging fruit that we kind of want to capture in getting to that point where then, yes, we still need to think about it, analyze the data, make sure it makes sense. The other point, which is not, it's relevant, but it's not so critical to this issue here, is about not uploading data into the internet because it's sensitive, if it's confidential. But I mean, that goes without saying for anything, frankly, but just bear in mind with AI especially, because some of the solutions that offer AI or generative AI require you to upload the data. So if you're thinking, oh, well, I'm going to use this solution because it's going to do all this for me, well, just be wary. Don't put any sensitive data. By all means, use dummy data and get the kind of solution, or at least the answer that you're looking at, and then use real data internally. In fact, this is what's happening in Treasury, and I think we're going to talk about this later on. Companies have already recognized, because there's another dimension to the whole AI debate, which is around the legal regulatory framework. Europe have already brought out AI Act, which a number of companies have, or all companies have to apply. But it's important to recognize there that you will be penalized if you do not apply the rules that they are required under the AI Act. And a lot of it's around privacy, around sensitive data, making sure that you're not, giving your client or your customers data up. So this is one of the aspects, again, of the evolution of AI. And I think in the US, they're bringing out an AI Act shortly, but haven't done it yet. A number of moving parts that will come together, but it's important that when we look at this area, there's on one hand, as a treasurer, I'm thinking we can't ignore it. We need to try and be open to what's happening out there. Be very cautious, obviously, but don't be afraid. This is the other point. And it seems like a lot of contradictions. They're not. You can use a sandbox. A sandbox is where you just do a test system and you play around with it. There's no harm of getting it wrong. And that's what that technology allows you. The other point I did want to make is that a number of companies, because of the AI legal requirements, are now ring-fencing how their employees access generative AI, which I think is, again, another great idea, because then you're allowing your employees to have access to this technology, but then you're not exposing them or exposing the company to the outside world.
That's an excellent point about protecting the data. If AI requires large data sets to learn and you need to train it on those, that's great. But most of those models pull that data into the ether at some level that's used. And so that ring fencing, you're protecting it. So you're learning on your data, but it's not being shared seems vital. I do want to ask another question on the cash flow forecasting, because AI is being used in cash flow forecasting in two primary areas. One main of the primary areas is some of the different technology vendors and banks provide forecasting models within their systems. So they have the ability to use pattern detection and some AI for forecasting. We see that out on the receivable side. We see that in Treasury systems, where it's learning quite a bit from what's gone on. And the forecasting, one of the things that's interesting, let's say on the receivable side, is the forecasting changes from using regression analysis, large numbers and detecting fitness, to detailed forecast by trading partner. And that level of accuracy, it just wasn't possible to do that. And so it provides some superiority there. That seems to be the primary area that Treasury is using AI, is delivered through a bank, through a TMS vendor, through a different technology provider. The second area seems to be far more limited. It's where generally high-tech companies are using that with their own large data sets, and they're using their engineers to help run and do those models. That's much more limited. With the changes over time, what's going to change in the workforce? What needs to change in the workforce to support that? Because maybe you agree with this or not, but it seems to me that there's going to be far more capabilities available to almost everybody, through systems and through their banks, through their tech vendors and the banks, versus those that can build their own models. That seems a little farther away from most companies. High-tech companies, non-bank financial institutions, banks will be building their own. They are building their own. And then there's most of the rest of the companies, which seems to me will rely on that. Is that true? And then what should the workforce do to contemplate those differences? And is there anything different between those two?
This is an excellent question because it actually really demonstrates how big a challenge this is for Treasury actually today, specifically because it's all mainly about Treasury, but for the wider world. Try and address the kind of the different buckets that you've kind of included in your question. You mentioned the banks and the TMSs, and you mentioned the solution providers, technical, and then the corporates. And you're absolutely right. That's kind of broadly speaking the three different groups that deal with cash flow forecasting. Certainly the banks have invested a lot more in AI and in offering cash flow forecasting. They are probably mostly for small to medium-sized companies. That's kind of where I see it at the moment. The more bespoke solution providers, absolutely, they have tended to be more successful with not just small to medium-sized companies, but even some of the larger ones. But in both those cases, what you're dealing with is a bespoke solution, fundamentally. I know sometimes there can be some customization for the technical solution providers, but there's only so much they'll be willing to do for a particular corporate. And overarching all these three groups is a big question mark, in my view, in terms of where are you, regardless if you're small, medium or large, in your journey on technology. It's fine that you and I are now talking about cash flow for generative AI and all these other amazing technologies, but if you've got a corporate that's, for whatever reason, still resisting even using cloud-based solutions, you've got not a problem, but you've got a major obstacle, in my view. So that's why I say sometimes, with any corporate, you really need to address where you are in your journey, and say technology specifically, and where do you want to get to. Coming back to those two groups, they're limited to the degree that they have a bespoke solution. You take it or leave it, it's off the shelf. It's unlikely, say, a bank would offer you a solution and say, we'll customize it for you. It doesn't make sense. Where I see the big game changer for cash flow forecasting is that third group, corporates that so far have not found the bespoke solutions or the off-the-shelf solutions suitable. But with generative AI now on the scene, there's that huge potential for these corporates to develop their own solution. And you made a point early on where you thought it might not happen that soon. I would kind of disagree to a point there. I'm not sure in terms of what that quantum will look like globally, but I would say those companies that have so far found it difficult, let's say, to find that perfect solution would be more likely to implement something within the next 2 years. Because, and this is now the other area where it kind of slightly goes into, what will Treasury look like in the next, let's say, 2 years? Might say 5 years, but I think 5 years is a long way away. I think 2 years is more realistic, ironically. So we talk about generative AI. Now, the thing with generative AI is, yes, you can argue it offers a particular benefit and you don't need to know more than that. If it's got a solution that happens to be generative AI, great, as long as it gives me what it says on the tin. There are treasurers, particularly the new generation, but there are some of my generation as well, that are looking at the coding languages like Python. And what generative AI is able to do, like ChatGPT, for example, and Claude AI, is you can get these applications with very limited coding language to write code for you and to provide almost, or create, if you like, a solution for you. Now, you'd have to be a bit more switched on in terms of open to that language and the coding, and also willing to invest the time and so on and so forth. But the potential is there. And I know from personal experience that this generation are studying coding at universities to a degree. I mean, depending on what your particular major is, but nevertheless, they're teaching as a standard. In fact, actually, I'll go one step further. I asked the question, I said, what's the youngest age that our education system in the UK is teaching children to code? Do you want to guess?
5.
Yes. Spot on. Well done. 5 years old, and they're going, which is brilliant in some ways because you kind of, we're keeping up. But the point behind that is that there's, for my generation, might be quite sort of, this is not something we're comfortable with, which is fine because there are solutions, there are other resources you can use, and in fact, people you can use that can do that. But my point is that when I came into the workplace, we'd be looking at Excel spreadsheets, using macros, pivot tables, that sort of thing. That was the limit of programming. Again, that opened this whole door, if you like, to creating solutions that, using AI, that can automate. And you're, again, looking at a very limited resource and to some degree, very limited experience. These are not people that have been in the industry for 30, 40 years. Because that's, again, it's a quid pro quo with AI. It has this huge amount of potential, but at the same time, you don't need to have that huge amount of insight and knowledge necessarily. It helps, but you don't need to. So this is going forward.
I liked your point about using some of the generative AI tools to generate Python code. If we think about where we were, it's like we used to have to key all that stuff in, and we keyed it in and put it on cards, and we ran. And it was run through systems, and now it's you had to know Python or C++ or whatever, and now we can use the tools to generate that code. The promise is natural language. You want to ask questions of the data in a natural language, and so sometimes we're doing that. We do that if you're using Copilot or ChatGPT, you ask a question and then you refine the question to get the answer you want. And so sometimes we're tapping into that. Others, it's a two-step process. Build the code that I can run in this engine that works. We've done a shortcut to natural language, even for creating Python code. Write code for this, spits it out, you run it. It just simplifies and shortens the process.
I've got a question for you.
Okay.
With your podcast, I know it's recorded, but say, for example, if you're ever in a situation where you're interviewing someone, have you got any tools that transcribe what they're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So we have, so when we record our podcast, right now we're doing it live. We just have recording devices, old school recording devices, maybe not that old, but when we do it, we'll have people have a recorder for the highest quality audio. And then we'll use Zoom or Teams, and that can provide a clear transcription. It records the audio as a backup for it. I'm sure you've used those at work for like meeting summary.
Teams do it.
If you look at the meeting summary notes, they're pretty good.
I know.
Like it summarizes and cuts out all the nonsense and gives you a pretty clear, like you read through and it's like, I don't have too much to add to that. The action items, especially if you've stated them clearly, it comes through and it's a better note taker than almost every note taker.
And this, another excellent example of generative AI, in my view, because why is it so powerful? Why are we even talking about it? It's because it's efficient. It's saving time. It's adding some value. We know it's not perfect, as you say. You still have to check it to make sure it makes sense. But it's another tool. And I know many people in your position, i.e. journalists or editors, are using it to great effect, especially if you're doing a lot of these on the road type podcasts and interviews. Time is limited, and unfortunately, this is kind of it is a double-edged sword, and we'll come on to that in terms of how we manage this from a mental health perspective, because we mustn't forget about our well-being. But there's so many cliches I can bring up. The train's left the station, so whether you're on it or not, you have the choice. Even if you're not on it, you can still kind of follow closely behind it, but it's your choice whether you want to completely ignore what's happening around you. What we're talking about today, we all know this for sure, is a fact in my view, is going to be outdated at the end of the day, tomorrow, and in fact more than likely in 6 months, 12 months time. It's for sure, because we've had these podcasts before and we were talking, I don't know, maybe even digital twins are still around, but the degree to which it was impacting Treasury, we've moved on from there. It's something that we should all be conscious about.
On another podcast, I want to talk about the technology changes with you and the different scenarios. One is the train has left the station, like you have to be on it because the tech is moving. And then other situations where there's examples of countries we were talking before this podcast about, they've been extremely far behind on technology, and then you go and implement the newest technology and it's 5 to 8 times better than what everyone else is using, but everyone else has that tech debt out there. I think that'll be a an interesting conversation. The last thing I want to talk about on this one, if you had another moment, was to talk about cybersecurity, the use of AI on cybersecurity. It's being used in payment hubs, treasury systems to spot anomalies or differences, right? If you can spot anomalies, that's how something seems off, that's the whole thing. It's like, I got intuition. It's like, no, you spotted something was off. You can't articulate what it was. And that's why you got that weird feeling. As soon as you know, it's like, oh, that guy was, whatever, had a trench coat in summer. Maybe not like that, but it's some way of spotting that. And is there more to cybersecurity than just anomaly detection, do you think?
Yeah, it's a toughie, that one, in some ways, because when we talk about cybersecurity, I'm not an expert in terms of the wider remit for cybersecurity. Let's limit it to what I'm kind of more familiar with in terms of Treasury. And most often when you talk about cybersecurity, it's around payments and data protection, frankly. If you talk to someone today, a young person, about technology we use there, well, limited technology, even fax machines or so modems, they look at you blankly and think, what on earth are you talking about? Some would argue that's actually more secure than the technology we're using today. But that doesn't mean we need to go back to those times and use that technology as much as if you said to someone, okay, the smartphone potentially came in 2006 onwards, would you ever consider going back to before that day and having a smartphone that didn't have internet access? Again, ironically, there is a movement, particularly for young children, where parents of young children, and certainly in the UK, have formed a group or association to limit their children to having a phone that's just allowed to send messages and make calls. Because access to internet, for particularly under 12s, let's say, is not always a healthy thing. So there's obviously dangers in everything that we have kind of seen as a benefit. But really coming back to your point about cybersecurity, the challenge we've faced, I think, is that whereas previously you've had human interaction mostly in making payments, whether admittedly not so much through a modem, but if you've gone into a branch or you're talking to a branch manager on the phone, those are sort of things we used to have to do 20, 30 years ago maybe. And there was always an element where the human involved knew whether this was looking right. Like you said, this doesn't smell right. Today with the technology, it's kind of impossible to do that just purely with the human eye, so to speak. So this is where the technology comes in. As much as it's being used by these nefarious perpetrators, we are also using or need to use the technology to protect us from what they're trying to do. My personal belief is that the technology will become most powerful in terms of cybersecurity when we're able to use more of our biometric data. A lot of banks are already using it, whether it's through voice or through your iris or even your thumbprint. I think these are definitely positive and strong forms of how you use cybersecurity. Perhaps if you go further down, might be a bit tennis. My personal belief is we do end up with some sort of digital ID. I know some countries have that already, but I would go as far as to say maybe it may even be embedded in our body, in our wrist, something along those lines. Sounds a bit spooky, but it's just about how do we stay not only one step ahead of the criminals, but also importantly protect ourselves, ensure that we're able to protect our companies and make those payments. We've heard about the dark web. We heard about the scam in the Far East that was using fake teams to convince an employee to make payments. So all of these are part of that journey, which are making cybersecurity professionals aware what we need to do to ensure that we don't get scammed or we don't fall for these type of scams. One thing I will say though, Craig, on top of everything else that I've said so far, technology, I've always raved about it, but and I always say in the same breath, it's not the be and end all, because when you think in terms of Treasury and people say, oh, technology is going to make us redundant or replace it, it can never do that, not at the moment, for the simple reason we need human intervention. And so I come back and take that same thought and say with Treasury in particular, I've always maintained it's about the processes, fundamentally, first and foremost, before you even think about the technology. So if you're looking at a payment process, just as an example, I would say make sure you identify all of your steps through that process and hopefully identify if there are any loopholes or weaknesses in that chain. And then when you mitigate those loopholes or the weaknesses, typically I would expect technology to play a part in that. But as you do that, and to give an example, in our case, we, like most companies, when we set up a new supplier, we have to have that independently verified. That at the moment is done through human intervention. There are solutions out there that can do it for you. And possibly in the future we'll consider doing that. I mean, I think a lot of TMSs already work, and banks are working with these third-party security firms, which would be great. That's, again, great value for us corporates. But the point at the end of the day is that in order to ensure that we are using, first of all, the point at the end of the day should be we're retaining cybersecurity. You know, we're keeping our company secure. Ideally, it makes sense to use the technology, but it doesn't always have to be that. You know, so what if you have to use someone, a human being, to make sure that process is secure? Well, that's more important. But ultimately, I can see the technology offering us those efficiencies by enabling a lot of these checks and balances to take place. And I mean, there's so many case studies I've seen where companies have argued that their whole process end to end is pretty much automated, and you know, any kind of, like you mentioned earlier on, pattern anomalies throw up red flags. Well, that's fine as far as I'm concerned where we are at the moment. But I wouldn't even want to, and I think you may have heard this as well, look at what's happening on the dark side in terms of the amount of money that's lost through cybercrime. It's horrendous. And that's something that we still, I think the banks, fintechs, corporates are all trying to address, but it's not something that can be done overnight. But we don't stop.
Recent article about in the US, let's just call it enforcement used AI to find much, much more fraud than they've ever been able to find. They've started using that, and it's been helpful for them to detect anomalies and patterns. And so it's this escalating warfare of AI, offense and defense. Thank you so much, Royston.
Thank you, great. That's great.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.